Dr. Ian Lillico is a former teacher and school principal and an international consultant in boys' education. He is the founder and chief executive officer of the Boys Forward Institute, and he is the father of 3 sons. Ian visited Cairns in July 2016 as the guest of St Augustine's College to deliver several workshops sharing practical strategies relating to boys and ways of supporting them in school and life. This interview was conducted by Catholic Education Services Cairns.
Well, I suppose the first thing to understand is that my institute, Boys Forward Institute, came from that very notion that we had boys working in the background doing the labouring and the girls serving you. And Boys Forward means that unless they move forward and serve the customer and develop those interpersonal skills, they're not going to have a job as we know it. The job market is changing very dramatically, and I'm finding that boys are very content to blend into the background, not stand out of the crowd, whereas girls will actually often take the initiative and they'll be out there in front and relating to the customers. So it's very, very important that as parents and as teachers and people in the community, we encourage boys to have a go, to develop their interpersonal skills, and when they do it really, really well. So in many of the restaurants that I visit, when a young man is trained to be a server and to wait on you, does a fantastic job, but there needs to be training. The girls are more naturally able to do with that. One of the crucial parts of my research, which came from the work of William Pollack in the USA, was that when a boy is vulnerable, and many of our boys are vulnerable, they pretend to be really tough and really macho and very cool, but underneath it they're often hurting. Boys tend to grow from the outside in, so the outer part looks as though it's a big stropping young man, but in fact the inside is still forming. And what we find is that if they don't feel secure, if they don't feel safe in an environment, they tend to put a really tough mask on, but underneath it they're often very, very vulnerable. So if you've got a very soft lolly or chocolate, you've got to have a harder outer casing to keep it together. And we find that on the outside, people see these really tough-looking boys, but underneath it, they're very, very easily hurt, and particularly by verbal assaults. So anyone who attacks their sexuality, calls them a name, that pierces the mask. The physical stuff doesn't do much to that. So in homes, it's very important that when a boy comes home from school, he can take his mask off, and if he's had a difficult day or people have been hard on him, he can relax and enjoy his life. But if he doesn't feel safe, either in the home or the school or in other environments, he continues to wear this tough mask, and in some cases that can cause some mental health issues in later life. Okay, when it comes to the masks that our boys tend to wear, and some boys will go right through life and schooling without a mask, the thing that's probably most important is that they need to feel safe. And they need to take their mask off in a safe environment. So things like drama, music, dance, those types of things, especially in drama, I've seen boys put on a different mask or take their mask off and do things and be silly, things that they wouldn't necessarily do sitting in straight rows in a maths class. But what we need to remember is that the mask is there as a protection. And so if our homes are safe, if they're allowed to relax when they get home, if we don't make it into a very, very strict environment, boys can take their masks off safely. And sometimes if your son's sitting on the couch and he's got a horrible kind of grimace on his face, sometimes a hug will actually break that. If you get hurt, I don't take any responsibility. But we've got to kind of, again, make sure that they feel safe. And when they take their mask off and they say, "Mum, I'm feeling whatever," please, that's not the time to bite their head off. Now, they time it poorly. So they might come in 8 o'clock on a Sunday night and say, "A bit anxious about my test tomorrow." And the parents go berserk. "Tomorrow? When you told me 2 weeks ago, you never do any jolly work." And as a result of it, he slithers back to his room thinking, I shouldn't have actually taken my mask off. I shouldn't have said how I was feeling. So when they do give you the honour of taking the mask off and say, "I'm feeling whatever," or "I'm sorry about this," try not to make that the opportunity to tear into them. Just kind of, bite your tongue, listen to what they've got to say, and try not to judge. And very recently, in the last bit of work that's been done around resilience, we've said that when we're relating to our sons in particular, we need to try to match their emotional state. So they are happy we need to try to put ourselves into a happy mode. If they are sad, we need to be a bit melancholy. We've got to make sure we match it. The only time we never match their emotional state is if they're hostile or angry. We don't get angry back. We don't get hostile back. And that way, often the boy will then be able to take the mask off, feel safe, feel listened to, feel heard, and often we can see some remarkable outcomes as a result. We encourage parents to look for the qualities of our boys. They are very, very special people, both with my 3 sons and the many boys that I've taught and got to know. Underneath, again, some of the exterior, they've got some amazing qualities. And when I ask parents, you know, what is great about your son, I get things that they're very loving, they're very caring, they're very affectionate, they're very helpful, they're very curious, the things that you mention. But very often when I ask the boys, you know, what is great about being a boy, I don't get that from them. So in a classroom, it's very important that we tap into what makes them special, ask them what's great about being male. We need to celebrate maleness in our society, and very sadly, we've almost taken it as a negative, and some mothers are, you know, loath to say I have 3 sons for the fact that they think they're saying I've got a very difficult, you know, nasty house, which is just the opposite. In a classroom, we will encourage teachers to look at a bit of competition in a classroom, using a little bit of curiosity to engage the boy, certainly using humour, trying to, you know, use humour in a classroom to get them on board. They rate humour very, very highly. And if we don't tap into what makes them special, then we don't give them a chance to blossom. It's very tough, and we find that, yes, praise is not an easy thing. And the other thing that makes it even more complex is that dads and father figures and male teachers find it harder to praise boys than they do to praise girls. Oscar Wilde said that men are never disarmed by compliments, women always are. So it's very important to get that sense of, I want to use praise in a very positive way. If I actually punish or give a consequence to a behaviour, we tend to hold behaviour down. If we, you might hold it down for the whole of their schooling, but we don't change it. If we actually tell a boy off or criticise something he's done at home, we might contain his behaviour, but the times we praise him doing the right thing are the times when he's more likely to repeat it. So we said, we walked past your bedroom today, Stuart, noticed that your bed was made. I was so proud of you. There's more incentive for him to make his bed, but if we, you know, yell and scream or telling off for not making his bed, there's no incentive to improve. And that's all through the years we've been we find it difficult to praise our boys. Boys don't praise each other very well. Rather than saying, gee, I like your hair today, Tom, he punches his mate in the arm. So boys don't use verbal praise as much. And as a result of that, and as a result of not getting the praise, sometimes home and school, they have an artificially low self-esteem. With the whole aspect of bullying, it's a very complex one in our society, and it's made more complex by the fact that we've got cyberbullying. And I'll deal with them separately. Boys are desperately intact when it comes to their self-esteem. They want to be liked, want to be valued, they want to have friends. Bullying destroys that, and bullying destroys their self-esteem. In terms of signs, a boy who comes home and goes to his room, I get straight onto the internet, getting lost in Xbox or PlayStation, maybe he's trying to say, I'm trying to drown the world out, things aren't nice. Also, when he inadvertently just hits the dog or does something that's out of character, we need to look and see what's going on. Very often the most common sign of a boy being bullied is if he's bullying someone else. So he's bullying his younger sister or his brother or something like that. Not just hitting them, because that's part of the sibling rivalry, but he's actually taking it out on someone else. And that's almost like a self-perpetrating thing that we find. With the cyber, the fact that you don't know who's doing it often is the case. It could be that the audience could be the entire world potentially, whereas when you're bullying face to face, there could be 1 or 2 or 3 people watching it. So we suddenly escalate that very, very fast. And also the anonymity of the bully, and also the fact that if it's done on the mobile phone, and the mobile phone's next to the bed most nights on vibrate mode, the bullying continues even in your bed, in your bedroom. There's no escape. And if that was a common school bully, you'd come home and you were safe. But now wherever you go, wherever you access technology, which is almost everywhere for many boys, there's no escape from it. So parents must take it really, really seriously. If the parents think their child is being bullied, and this is difficult to do, what they must not demonstrate to the child is anger. And even though it's a natural thing to get angry, how dare that child do that to my son or to my daughter? As soon as the children see anger, they think, oh, you're going to go and make it worse. You're going to go to the person's house. You're going to cut off the internet. You're going to destroy my mobile phone or my provision to the internet. And that is almost social death for a child, particularly one who's on the borderline of acceptance. So I say to parents, don't show anger. Show concern and say, now let's look at ways of solving the problem. If you don't call it a problem and you don't externalise it from the actual student, then the student thinks, but it doesn't matter what we call it, I'm the cause of it. And they're not the target. Most students are just chosen randomly because they have attributes that the person who's bullying would rather have, like they're very intelligent, or they wear glasses, or they're very studious. And the jealousy is often the reason it's done. So that we actually have a whole series of things that I love parents to look at on the website, boysforward.com, and they can then look at ways of approaching it. And let's talk about ways we can solve the problem together. But if we don't do it, if we don't address it that way, and we don't do anything about it, the boy who's bullied often becomes the bully. So again, he will tend to perpetrate that. And sometimes we catch it at the point the parent says, my son is bullying other people, but in fact, if we go back a bit earlier in that sequence, we find that someone has bullied him. The whole aspect of peer groups is a really complex one in our society, especially now that boys can have, and girls, peer groups that are online. So it's actually made it a little bit more difficult. When it comes to good and bad peer groups, we've got to be very careful, because I really believe deep down there's no such thing as a bad child, but sometimes the mix of people within a peer group can be unsatisfactory in the way they interact with each other. So when we look at peer pressure, first of all, for boys, rather than peer groups, peer pressure, we know on an average peaks at 12 years of age. But for girls who mature, obviously, up to 18 months earlier, it's at about 10 and a half as an average. So what I'd like people to do is to realise that at the age of 12 for boys and 10 and a half for girls, that's the time to take peer groups very seriously. And the groups that they'll have, the peer groups that they'll have at 12 for boys and 10 and a half for girls, will often affect their future very, very much. If the parent is unhappy with the group that her boy is mixing with, for example, it's very hard for her to say you shouldn't be playing with those kids, because boys have an automatic, these are great kids and these are lovely kids, and they look behind all of maybe the negative things or the things that the boys get up to, or the girls in the peer group. So in order for them to change peer groups to go with another group, the parent must find an alternative. So when, for example, one of my sons was growing up and maybe having a peer group that wasn't so satisfactory, we helped them form new friends. And we said, look, come and meet so-and-so, invite people over to our house. You've got to provide an alternative. With girls, they will more easily move to another peer group, but parents have to work very, very hard forming one. So, for example, the stayover, we used to call it a sleepover, but nobody sleeps these days during these times, and I can remember them. You need to maybe have at that stayover other people or other friends that the boy may or may not connect with. And if he does connect with, say, another boy or another girl and her group of friends, then the other ones just drift away. But it's very hard to say, don't mix with that group, don't play with that person. You've got to help them find alternatives. Well, it's I suppose going right back to the very earliest of times, we find that when men are sedentary, and when they're being eyeballed or questioned across a dinner table or whatever, they find it very hard to open up and be honest and to talk through issues. And that's gone on for ages. Right through history, men have had discussions by changing the tyre of a car, or going hunting or crabbing or fishing, or walking together, or jogging, or taking the dog for a walk. They just find it really awkward, because the thing that when little boys have an issue, rather than going and talking about it, they get onto their tricycle or their bicycle, or they work out, and they find that through movement they can deal with issues. So when a mother or father walks with their son, takes the dog for a walk with their son, or even does the wiping up or does some activity with them, that's the time, not eyeballing them, you can actually say, is there something wrong? Or the boy will often spontaneously say he's being teased, he's being bullied, he's worried about this, he's concerned about that. And it actually works, I think, also for girls, but for boys, we've got to try to make sure we don't sit them down, eyeball them, and ask them what's wrong. We just get, the single syllable or the grunting answers. When it comes to fathers engaging with their sons, the first thing I want to say to them is that they need to be very, very open to praising their child. Look for the positive rather than the negative. When they are praising their child, it's a very common thing for Australian fathers and fathers generally. Because they feel it maybe is a bit wussy or a bit, difficult, they will add a twist. So they'll say something like, Tom, your room is so wonderful and tidy. Why can't you always keep it like that? And so I say to fathers, don't add the word but to a bit of praise. Don't remind them of previous things that weren't so well done or were not so praiseworthy. And the very best way that a father can praise his son is to write it down, little note, no more than 2 or 3 lines, or the boy won't read it. And in that note, try to put a virtue. Things like patient or thoughtful or tolerant or caring or affectionate. If you just say generally well done or good boy, that doesn't stick. But the virtues in Australia that we use and overseas, they're ones that'll actually lift the self-esteem and really mean something to those boys. Mothers praise their sons all the time. And it's easier for, again, women and also their female teachers to praise a boy, and the praise tends to stick. Mothers will often praise their sons, again, as they're doing something, just before they go to sleep, as they're doing something around the home. But see, sometimes Dad comes home at a time when he's tired, he's wanting to watch TV, wants to kind of not do anything active. Sometimes it varies a lot. And we've got to say, you've got to go out of your way to have some activity with your child. Sometimes it'll happen on the weekend, but sometimes you might say, can you just drive to shop with me? I want you to help me carry the stores back. And even driving, which isn't that physically active, that's again a time that dads can actually give that praise. But what we have also found is that false praise is not good. And I've been at a number of school assemblies with small schools in the middle of Australia where, in order not to let people be left out, it ends up at the end of the assembly, all 25 kids are on the dais with an award, even for breathing or having an eye or goodness knows what they gave it for. You don't overpraise. If you overpraise, everything is amazing, you're so fantastic. When a boy then applies for a job, and he's always got an award for doing anything at school, but he applies for a job at the local supermarket and doesn't get an interview, he thinks, well, that's not right, I have to. Everyone gets a job, everyone gets acknowledged. So there's a kind of a plea to parents not to overdo the positives, make sure your child can deal with the negative and give them that resilience to cope with it. It's very important. I've dealt with a number of schools even in the last 10 days that I've been away from home, and I've said you need to work together. Really, it's a partnership between the student, the teacher, which is critical, and the teacher and the parent, and of course the parent and the student. If one of those connections is not working well, then we don't get an overall result and we play one off against the other. So, one of the areas that always comes up is, should we stay in touch with a school? Should we leave it to the school to do the job with our son and our daughter? And we say, no, you've actually got to be involved. But unfortunately, the parents that will come along to the open night or the parent night or whatever are the ones who will always come. And sometimes the one you'd really want to see to talk about your son or your daughter and about trying to work together with them, they'll often not turn up. So the plea is that any parents watching, please be involved with your school. And of course, we also find some parents in frustration will talk negatively about their teacher in front of their son or their daughter, or use names, etc. And then the boy and the girl's respect for the teacher will start to diminish. And we're all different. Even though it's a wonderful job teaching our children, the constant ratio of 30-1 will sometimes mean that the teacher in frustration or stress will say something that he or she doesn't mean. We've got to be very careful to kind of wipe them off with that and try to work with them to really look beyond what they've said immediately. In terms of things around the home, what's happened in our society, there's been a shift from camping and caravanning and crabbing and fishing and connecting with nature to more 5-star resorts and staying in a resort and using maybe the swimming pool there and watching in-house movies, on the internet, playing computer games. And what we've found from research, and it's yet to be completely verified, is that the kids who don't connect with nature, who don't get the sand between their toes, who don't think, now in that river there could be fish or there could be crabs, and don't commute with nature, they are the kids who will often abuse nature. So graffiti, vandalism, arson, those types of things are very rarely committed by people who actually connect with nature. It's also very important to allow a boy and a girl to do non-stereotypical tasks. So, I hate to see in a home that the boy is chopping the wood and the girl is cooking the food. You've got to make sure that both will take equal roles. And the other thing, I suppose, when it comes to chores, etc., is that parents shouldn't be slaves to their kids. They must actually allow the children to do and insist they do certain things as being a child in the home. And they, even though they deserve their, as I said, their 5-star resorts and their wonderful holidays, when their children commute with nature, when they do the outdoor things, as I said, they respect nature. But also they get a sense of, I can do something. So we used to look at things like outdoor education in our schools, where the kids out in the wilderness could actually work out which direction is the road and how I can cook a meal and how I can survive. And even though many people think that might never happen to me, there could be times in their life when it's going to be very useful. Yes, adolescence is one of those times that I suppose we face the greatest challenge as parents. And we go from the boy, particularly to the mother who will talk, and I did this at school and I was very excited, to just the monosyllabic grunts. It's a very hard time for both boys and girls growing up in our society at the moment. It's made harder by the fact that they look at the screen images of how boys are and how girls are and relationships, and he kisses the girl and violins go and there's no zits, they're all kind of taken out through Photoshop. And boys are often never really happy with who they are. So it's very important that parents realise that during the adolescent years, which can range from 8 up to 35, depending on what part of Australia you're from, and if you're in a country compared to the city, it's a long road. We need to be there for them. We don't necessarily need to have verbal communication during the times they don't want to talk, but it could be the fact that you're sitting there and you're watching Star Trek together, or you're there and you say, look, I wouldn't mind just having a game with you, whether you can do the game or not. It could be a computer game. But I say to parents, don't move away for your child. Be there, be present. You also, according to Andrew Fuller, need to be a benevolent dictator and say, we are going to go and visit Auntie so-and-so or your grandmother. And you need to also muscle in. They need to be with you. They need to be near you. But some parents inadvertently in adolescence, they withdraw and they say, well, I'm not going to obviously talk to you, or I'm not going to interact with you because all I'm getting is negative, negative, negative. They're there. You've just got to be present, and those remarkable times will happen that even during adolescence, you get glimmers of, your old child. And then as he kind of comes to grips with testosterone and all the poisoning that goes through the system, you get him back.